Nearly a million years in the past, our species came close to vanishing. This wasn't a scene from a far-off disaster film or a sci-fi story. It really happened in our own history, the true account of humankind. And the truly chilling part is this. Almost all 99% of early humans disappeared, completely erased. Across the whole Earth, merely 280 people capable of reproduction remained. Take a moment to let that sink in. 1,280 individuals. That's fewer people than you'd find in many high schools. It's less than a standard college campus, even smaller than the audience in a cinema. And those 280 people were the sole barrier between our species surviving and becoming yet another extinct life form, completely forgotten. If you've put this on to help yourself drift off, that's wonderful. That's precisely the reason I create these videos. So perhaps consider subscribing, and be sure to drop a comment sharing your current location and the time there. Honestly, I read each comment, and it's incredible. From Tokyo at dawn to London during midday, all the way to Los Angeles in the dead of night, all tuning in simultaneously. It's like a worldwide slumber party, where everyone is absorbing captivating knowledge as they slowly fall asleep. Let's return to the story of our near annihilation. This is no old legend. This isn't mere guesswork. This represents groundbreaking genetic research that came to light just in 2023. For the very first time in our species' existence, we have concrete proof that humanity once dwindled to such a tiny group. That, by all logic, we shouldn't be here now. Just consider the improbability of it all. Whenever the numbers of a species sink under a couple thousand, they never bounce back. Biologists have a term for this, the extinction vortex. Once trapped inside that vortex, you keep spiraling downward until nothing remains. Genetic issues pile up. Inbreeding makes each generation weaker. Just one drought, one sickness, one harsh winter can erase everyone still alive. Take passenger pigeons. They once numbered in the billions across North America. Billions. Then humans began hunting them relentlessly, and their population collapsed. When they fell below a critical point, recovery became impossible. The very last passenger pigeon passed away in 1914, vanishing forever. Cheetahs experienced a similar fate around 12,000 years ago. Their numbers plummeted so dramatically that every cheetah living now is genetically nearly identical. They could exchange skin grafts without any rejection. They're essentially all twins. And cheetahs continue to face challenges. They remain endangered. They never truly recover. Yet somehow, defying every mathematical expectation and every biological forecast, our ancestors not only made it through, they flourished. Right now, more than 8 billion people inhabit the Earth. We've dominated every continent besides Antarctica. We've launched machines to Mars, broken apart the atom, and sequenced the human genome. We're the most prosperous large mammal around, and it almost never happened. So what force could have reduced humankind to only about 1,280 souls? What kind of disaster could have swept away 99% of a species scattered throughout Africa, and maybe even into parts of Europe and Asia? What catastrophe was so severe that it almost wiped out humankind before we had truly gotten started? Could it have been a supervolcano that choked the sky with ash and cast the entire world into darkness? Was it a climate disaster that transformed lush landscapes into empty deserts? Or a plague that raced through communities faster than anyone could flee? Or perhaps it was something completely different, something we still have not conceived of. This evening, we'll delve into one of the most profound enigmas in the story of human evolution, a riddle that no one even realized was there until a researcher in China began noticing seemingly impossible patterns within genetic information. Patterns indicating that our complete grasp of human history had a missing section. The most crucial chapter of all, the one where we nearly didn't survive. We'll trace the genetic detective work, seeing how scientists assemble clues from the DNA of thousands of individuals across the globe. We will trace genetic changes backwards across the ages, as if we are stepping along faint clues in a shadowy woodland. We shall uncover the face of the Earth 900 millennia in the past, when our forebears prospered and dispersed over vast land masses. They were crafting innovative tools and experiencing existences that are almost beyond our comprehension. And then we will observe the downfall, a devastating happening or chain of happenings, that wiped out community after community, leaving just a handful of survivors. We will examine the foremost hypotheses, the ideas that researchers hold. What occurred in that bleak epoch when the fossil evidence falls nearly mute and traces of human beings vanish from the archaeological layers. Yet the most astonishing chapter of this tale is not the disaster itself. It is what followed. 117,000 years, that is, the span during which our species clung to such dangerously small counts. Not merely 117 years, nor even 170, but 117 millennia of barely holding on, while the majority of other creatures around us faded into oblivion. As other species vanished in our vicinity, how did these few endure? Where did they dwell? And what tools or societal frameworks enabled a group that was so tiny to persist for 100,000 years? What shifted our destiny, and how did we eventually fight our way back from the brink? Rising from the verge of annihilation to become Earth's ruling species, we will also delve into the unforeseen aftermath of our close encounter with doom, and how these 117 millennia of endurance fundamentally altered human DNA, and how our chromosomes actually merged during that time, an event that occurs perhaps only once every millions of years. How our minds developed in directions that would likely never have occurred had we stayed a numerous, unchanging populace. And we will learn why this holds significance in the present time, why grasping this overlooked cataclysm clarifies so much, from why people are more vulnerable to specific illnesses compared to other primates, and to why our genetic makeup is so alike even though we are scattered across every continent. 6 enigmas, a single primordial disaster, and the most extraordinary saga of endurance, ever narrated, because every living human being today, all 8 billion of us, are directly descended from those 1,280 holdouts. Those holdouts declined to surrender, even when surrender seemed the only sensible choice. Make yourself comfortable, unwind, and let your thoughts travel back 900,000 years to when humanity came close to vanishing, and a handful of resilient forebears made their choice. Our narrative still had more to unfold, a genetic mystery revealing how researchers unearthed our long-lost near disaster. The revelation didn't arise from fossils or old ruins, it came from within you. Inside your DNA, and the DNA of countless everyday individuals going about their normal routines, rested proof of humanity's nearest encounter with annihilation, though none of them knew it. Back in 2023, a group of scientists from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai released research that fundamentally changed our understanding of human origins. They examined the genetic codes of 3,500 present-day humans drawn from populations worldwide. People of African, European, Asian, Native American, and Pacific Islander descent, all the main human lineages were accounted for. By employing state-of-the-art computational genomics, they pieced together our evolutionary history. The pattern that emerged from the data was something that, by all logic, should not have existed. The statistics indicated that roughly 900 millennia ago, the human population shrank to under 1,300 individuals capable of reproduction, and that this bottleneck persisted not merely for several generations or even a few millennia, but for 117,000 years. That span is over double the time that our own species, Homo sapiens, has been on Earth. The researchers initially believed they must have erred. They repeated the entire analysis. The outcome was identical, so they scrutinized their computer models for any flaws. The models proved to be flawless. Next, they broadened their dataset, incorporating additional genetic sequences from even more varied groups. The signature of the bottleneck grew more pronounced, not less. They were facing the genetic version of a crime scene. All evidence pointed toward a catastrophe, a disaster that almost terminated the human saga before it had truly started. Yet how can the DNA of present-day individuals reveal events from 900,000 years ago? How is it possible for researchers to detect extinction events within the blood of people alive today? The explanation rests in recognizing that your genome functions as a chronicle of the past. Each gene, every chromosome, and all those seemingly random mutations serve as a testament to how your forebears managed to endure. Once you learn to interpret this record, it reveals tales that no fossil or ancient relic could ever convey. Let me explain the workings of genetic archaeology. Whenever a cell splits and replicates its DNA, there's a slight possibility of a mistake. A lone character in the genetic sequence is altered, leading to a mutation, and the vast majority of such mutations are entirely harmless. These mutations neither benefit nor harm you, they simply are there. Because they remain neutral, they accumulate at a fairly steady pace through time. This provides what scientists term the molecular clock when you compare your DNA with another person's. You can tally the differences between them and approximate how many generations back you both had a shared ancestor. A greater number of differences indicates a more distant split, while fewer differences suggest a closer kinship in time. Now apply this method to thousands of individuals drawn from communities across the globe. Then we can piece together the full genealogy of humankind, with branches reaching back into the past. Yet, there is something even more insightful than the sheer count of mutations. It is the very arrangement of genetic variation. In large, steady populations, genetic diversity remains high. Many distinct gene versions circulate among the people. Countless rare mutations have not yet become widespread across the whole group. Each person is genetically unique from all others in small yet quantifiable respects. Small populations tell a different story. When a group's numbers decrease sharply, its genetic variety also plummets. Picture a jar filled with 10,000 marbles, each of 1,000 distinct hues. Now, the set of 13 marbles cannot capture the full spectrum of 1,000 colors. Perhaps you would have 6 blue ones, 4 red ones, 2 green ones, and a single yellow one. All the remaining 996 colors have vanished. This is exactly what occurs to genetic variety when a population experiences a bottleneck. Now here is what makes this change irreversible. As that tiny population grows once more, every single new being traces its lineage back to those initial 13 marbles. Over time, you could end up with millions of marbles again, but they will only be shades of blue, red, and green. The genetic imprint of that bottleneck carries on through every generation to come. This is precisely what the 2023 study discovered in human DNA. When researchers examined genetic diversity throughout the entire human population, they uncovered a startling fact. We possess much less genetic variation than we ought to have. In comparison with other great apes, with the majority of mammal species, and with what population models forecast for a species that has existed as long as humans have, we find ourselves genetically poor. Two arbitrary individuals chosen from opposite ends of the earth are closer in genetic makeup than two chimpanzees from the same African forest. Just reflect on that. Chimpanzees who inhabit a single continent show greater genetic variety than humans who dwell anywhere from the Arctic to the tropics. That is far from typical. That is the mark of a bottleneck. Yet it becomes even more specific. As scientists applied cutting-edge computer methods to determine the moments when genetic lineages merged, they, tracing these lines back to shared forebears, revealed a tremendous convergence, roughly 900,000 years in the past. It felt as if they were observing streams of lineage flowing in reverse through the ages. Then, right near that point, every stream merged into a single, narrow channel. This method is formally called coalescence analysis. You start with genetic sequences from present-day humans and employ mutation rates to determine when various branches diverged. In A, if a population has remained large and steady over an extended period, the coalescence dates are spaced uniformly. Various branches separated at distinct moments, producing a seamless spread spanning hundreds of millennia. Yet that pattern did not appear. Rather, they discovered what researchers term a coalescent bottleneck. It was an era during which almost every genetic line in all human groups could be traced back to a minuscule ancestral group. According to the statistical models, the breeding population numbered merely 1,280 people. That does not represent the total population. It refers to reproductive individuals, adults capable of having children, along with the young and the old. The overall human count might have peaked at 2,000 individuals, perhaps a little higher, but no more than that. That constituted the entirety of humankind, and how long this bottleneck lasted was just as astonishing. This was no brief emergency. It was not a solitary catastrophic occurrence that wiped out most people, after which numbers quickly recovered. Genetic data revealed that the human count remained extremely small for 117,000 years, with more than 1,000 generations living on the edge of disappearance. For context, Homo sapiens, our own species, has existed as a separate lineage for only roughly 300,000 years. The ancestors who endured the bottleneck survived in a state of emergency for over a third of that total stretch. Behavioral modernity, the qualities that define our uniqueness as humans, encompasses artistic expression, sophisticated language, and conceptual reasoning. This cognitive ability, along with the others, developed during the past 100,000 years. Our bottleneck ancestors endured those harsh conditions for a longer period than the entire span of our modern existence. Upon its initial release, the study was met with doubt from the scientific community. This wasn't due to flawed methods, they were in fact rather advanced, but rather because the findings carried such massive consequences. Such a severe and prolonged bottleneck would normally have pushed human evolution to a standstill, and most species cannot bounce back from population crashes of this magnitude. Various scientists started verifying the results through alternative approaches. Some examined ancient DNA extracted from fossils. Still others employed various computational models to reconstruct past population sizes. When researchers examined particular genetic markers that are sensitive to population bottlenecks, the outcome remained consistent regardless of the method used. About 900,000 years ago, something almost caused the extinction of our species, yet we managed to survive. However, the genetic data uncovered an additional layer. What made this bottleneck even more astonishing was that the population didn't merely collapse. During those 117,000 years, human evolution underwent something entirely unprecedented. The genetic patterns indicated that natural selection was acting forcefully on many genes at the same time. Genes linked to brain growth, those that control stress reactions, and ones influencing social conduct, all of them displayed clear signs of powerful selection pressures during the bottleneck phase. This is quite unusual. Typically, evolution proceeds slowly, with tiny changes accumulating over countless generations. Yet during severe bottlenecks, evolution can speed up at an astonishing rate. In a population that small, any advantageous mutation can sweep across the entire species within a few thousand years. And with survival pressures being so intense, only the most beneficial traits manage to survive. The scientists discovered signs of this rapid evolution in what are known as selective sweeps. These happen when a helpful mutation emerges and propagates through a population at such speed. As it spreads, it pulls along nearby genetic sequences, leaving a traceable mark in today's DNA. During the bottleneck era, multiple selective sweeps were identified in genes associated with cognitive abilities, immune reactions, and metabolic efficiency. What proved to be even more informative were the genetic variations that vanished throughout the time of the bottleneck. Scientists were able to pinpoint specific gene variants by examining human DNA alongside that of Neanderthals and Denisovans. Both groups branched off from our ancestors at roughly the same time. Those variants were present prior to the bottleneck but disappeared once it had passed. The variants that were lost told a tale of incredibly intense selection pressures. During that period of crisis, any genetic characteristic that didn't aid directly in survival was removed from our ancestors' gene pool. Yet, the most convincing evidence might have come from examining something geneticists refer to as linkage. More specifically, linkage disequilibrium. This concept measures the frequency at which particular genetic variants get passed down together through generations. Within large populations, linkage tends to break down rapidly because sexual reproduction mixes up the genes every generation. Consequently, variants located near each other on the same chromosome slowly become split apart over time. However, in smaller populations, this genetic shuffling isn't as efficient. Variants that were linked together during the bottleneck event are likely to remain linked, even in today's human populations. When scientists looked at linkage patterns throughout the human genome, they discovered large stretches where variants were still connected. These patterns only made sense if the human population had been extremely small around 900,000 years ago. It was akin to discovering fingerprints at a crime scene where the evidence hadn't been wiped away by the passing of millennia. Every person living today still bears the genetic imprint of those harsh, desperate thousands of years. This research also resolved another puzzle that had lingered for a long time in human evolutionary studies. For many decades, anthropologists have been aware that some unusual event occurred with human chromosomes. Humans possess 23 pairs of chromosomes, whereas chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans each have 24 pairs. At some point in our evolutionary past, two chromosomes merged into a single one. And scientists can clearly observe the fusion point on human chromosome number 2. The genetic codes that ought to be located at the tips of two distinct chromosomes are found right in the center of just one chromosome. It is much like a scar that shows where the two chromosomes once fused together. But when, precisely, did this merging actually take place? And why did it not wipe out the ancestral line? Typically, fusions between chromosomes are catastrophic. Such fusions lead to issues with reproduction, developmental defects, and a lower ability to survive and thrive. A being that comes into the world with a fused chromosome will generally face trouble in having offspring. Under normal circumstances, the fusion would vanish from the group within 1 or 2 generations, unless the group was extremely tiny. If the population shrank to only 1,280 individuals, a fused chromosome could propagate across the whole species quite rapidly. This scenario is particularly likely if, by sheer luck, those who carry the fusion are a little bit more adapted to the constraints of the bottleneck. Alternatively, pure luck known to geneticists as genetic drift might have made the fusion widespread. This happened simply because the group was so tiny that the genetic contribution of each reproducing individual carried great weight. The alignment of time was perfect. It seems that the chromosomal fusion happened roughly 900,000 years ago, precisely at the start of the population squeeze. This was no accident. The bottleneck produced precisely the right environment for a mutation that is usually harmful to become permanent across all of humanity. Every one of us today bears a fused chromosome because our forebears passed through that tight genetic passage. When the population count dropped so drastically, randomness had the power to transform the whole species. Furthermore, the scientists drew comparisons between the human bottleneck and similar occurrences in other animals. Cheetahs, for example, experienced a drastic bottleneck. This happened around 10,000 years in the past, shrinking their numbers down to maybe 7,000 individuals. In modern times, cheetahs are so genetically similar that even skin transplants between strangers don't get rejected. They are almost like genetic duplicates, yet their population bottleneck wasn't nearly as extreme or as drawn out as that of humans. Due to hunting, the northern elephant seal population plummeted to under 100 animals in the 1890s. Since then, their numbers have rebounded to more than 200,000, but their genetic variation remains so limited that they are at risk from illness and shifts in the environment. The population has recovered, yet the genetic poverty continues, and their bottleneck endured for just a handful of generations, not 117,000 years. Mountain gorillas, with a present population of a little more than 1,000, are classified as critically endangered. Their genetic variety is decreasing, causing conservationists to fear for their long-term survival. Nevertheless, their population size matches what our human ancestors went through during that bottleneck. Think about sustaining those emergency-level population counts, not for just a few decades, but for more than 100,000 years. That's the ordeal our forebears underwent. The population constriction experienced by humans was extraordinarily intense in its own way. Among all great apes, all primates, and all large mammals, none have ever been recorded experiencing such a harsh and extended population collapse. And then came a triumphant rebound. Our species came nearer to vanishing than cheetahs, elephant seals, and every current endangered species. We came closer to extinction than any of them, and we lingered on the edge far longer. Not merely did those remarkable individuals manage to survive, but their offspring progressed to become Earth's most triumphant large animal. In the present day, the human population exceeds 8 billion. We have expanded into all continents and every type of ecosystem. We have fundamentally reshaped the Earth's climate, terrain, and living organisms. All of this can be traced back to a community tinier than a present-day hamlet, fighting to endure somewhere in Africa some 900,000 years ago. This investigation of our genes doesn't merely reveal that we made it through, it shows how that journey transformed us. That lengthy period of 117 millennia, filled with powerful selective forces, fine-tuned our evolutionary path in ways that continue to influence us even now. The mental skills that enabled our forebears to endure extreme environments laid the groundwork for all the qualities that define humanity. Advanced communication, conceptual thought, tool-making breakthroughs, and intricate group collaboration, every one of these attributes was favored by natural selection throughout that constricted era. Each person walking the earth today can trace their lineage back to that resilient group. Every individual you've encountered, every face you've glimpsed, has roots in that small community that barely held on in Africa. The clues locked in our DNA are crystal clear. Every one of us is a survivor of that population crash. Our DNA bears both the marks of that old catastrophe and the changes it brought about, and the scientists who uncovered this truth. Those researchers continue to study the information, gradually finding fresh insights. When you become aware of that narrow passage, you can search for particular markers of evolutionary pressure from that time. It becomes possible to pinpoint the genetic codes that faced the strongest demand. We can piece together the sorts of environmental difficulties that our predecessors encountered. We can also approximate the geographical location where that diminished group managed to endure. This narrative, woven from our heredity, continues to unfold. Fresh methods, improved algorithms, and bigger collections of information uncover additional specifics with each passing year. Yet the fundamental truths have been confirmed beyond any sensible uncertainty. Roughly 900 millennia in the past, a catastrophic event occurred. The number of humans dropped to less than 1,280 reproducing members, and that dangerously small count persisted for a span of 117,000 years. That duration was ample for the constriction to profoundly alter the course of human development, so lengthy that each person alive today bears its mark within their genetic code. Yet what triggered it? What force could push humankind to the brink of annihilation and hold us there for more than 100 millennia? That is the point where the genetic clues stop and the speculation starts. For DNA reveals the events and their timing, but remains silent on the reasons behind them. A glimpse of the world prior to the downfall, when our ancestors prospered. Let us journey into the distant past, roughly 900,000 years ago, plus or minus a few millennia. Before the catastrophe, before 99% of the human population disappeared, before it all transformed irrevocably. Imagine the planet as it existed at that time. Not the world you are familiar with. No urban centers, no agriculture, no pathways or boundaries or countries, yet it was far from desolate. Quite the opposite. Africa, humanity's birthplace, teemed with human life as it would not again for hundreds of millennia. The most reliable genetic models indicate a count of roughly 98 to 100,000 reproductive adults, those able to produce offspring, including children, adolescents, and elders. The overall population reached perhaps 150 to 200,000 souls. By today's measure, that seems modest. In the present day, that number fits a small town. At that epoch, it marked the peak of our family line's success. They were not modern humans, not quite. These were our forebears, groups categorized by anthropologists as either late Homo erectus or early Homo heidelbergensis. Depending on the specific fossils examined and the scholar consulted, the classification becomes ambiguous this deep in history. Yet the crucial point is that they were us, our direct lineage. Every living individual traces back to them, and they had thrived in the contest of existence for an immense stretch. By that era, Homo erectus had persisted for close to 1.5 million years. Reflect on that. 1.5 million years of unbroken endurance. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has been around merely 300,000 years. We still have far to travel to equal our predecessors' legacy. Those early humans had dispersed across the whole African landmass, stretching from the northern Mediterranean shoreline down to the southern Cape of Good Hope. They also spread from the western Atlantic coast to the eastern Ethiopian highlands. Wherever one could traverse on foot across Africa, people were present, though they were not spread uniformly. As with any clever species, they gathered in favorable locations, river basins with dependable freshwater sources, shoreline regions where marine harvest added variety to their nutrition, the borders of savannas where open plains merged with forests, forming abundant transitional zones, teeming with varied flora and fauna. The edges of woodlands where one could pursue game in the open, yet withdraw into shelter as needed. The terrain they occupied felt at once recognizable and strange relative to today's Africa familiar, because the fundamental layout remained unchanged. Across East Africa, the Great Rift Valley stretches, with the enormous Sahara Desert to its north. The Congo Basin's dense rainforest is in the middle, and the wide savannas spread across the east and south. Yet it felt alien, since the climate was not the same. 900 millennia ago, our planet was going through a prolonged era of unstable weather patterns. Glacial periods arrived and retreated, and worldwide temperatures changed drastically within fairly brief spans of time. A region that was a flourishing meadow for one generation might turn into a barren desert for the next. Waterways that had coursed for millennia could vanish in the span of a single human life. Our forebears had become adept at coping with such unpredictability. Adaptability was their defining trait. This trait was their greatest strength. When the rain stopped falling in one area, they simply relocated elsewhere. If big animals grew hard to find, they would switch to hunting smaller creatures or collect more edible plants. As the savanna region spread, they tracked the moving grasslands. When woodlands thickened, they adjusted to living among the trees. Their tools reflected this capacity for change. 900,000 years ago, techniques for crafting stone tools had already been advancing for more than 2 million years. Our forebears were not just haphazardly smashing stones together. These were talented artisans who knew the characteristics of various rocks and could create refined tools for particular tasks. The hallmark of their craft was the Acheulean hand axe. You might have seen images of stone implements shaped like teardrops, symmetric from both sides, with flakes removed to form sharp edges all the way around. Those are Acheulean hand axes. These are stunning artifacts. Certain archaeologists believe these might represent the earliest form of human artistry. These tools were crafted with more care than was functionally required, perhaps to show off skill or social standing. However, they were also extremely practical. With a skillfully crafted hand axe, one could carve up an elephant, and it also served for chopping wood. It could dig for roots, and if needed, double as a weapon. This tool was like the Stone Age equivalent of the Swiss Army knife. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this versatile implement had proven its worth time and again. They also crafted various other implements, scrapers for preparing animal skins and choppers designed to crack bones open for marrow. Basic spears, likely just wooden poles, and their tips were hardened in fire. Evidence hints that they might have fitted stone points onto wooden shafts. Using plant resins or animal sinews, they assembled composite tools, combining materials for greater efficiency. Fire-hardened spears hold particular importance, as they inform us of a key fact. These ancient people had mastery over fire, not merely taking advantage of lightning-caused fires, but actually generating it, sustaining it, and employing it with intent. To fire-harden, a wooden spear tip demands precise regulation of temperature and duration. This isn't something that happens by chance. You have to know how fire changes wood and how to control it for your own purposes. Fire was used for far more than just making tools. Sites from that era reveal distinct traces of hearths intentionally built fire pits where early humans cooked meals, kept warm, and socialized. Certain locations bear signs of deliberate vegetation burning, implying they possibly employed fire to shape their surroundings. Removing undergrowth could simplify hunting or promote the growth of desirable plants. Additionally, fire allowed them to make their days longer. Prior to the discovery of fire, human beings were active only during the day, just like many other primates, and they were defenseless after dark. The arrival of fire transformed their entire existence, and it drove away the shadows and also scared off dangerous animals. It formed a secure gathering area where folks could come together once the sun went down, strengthening their connections and exchanging things. This is where it becomes fascinating. Those nightly meetings by the hearth are likely where human culture truly took shape. Not the tangible culture of tools and crafts, but rather the social fabric of tales, interpersonal ties, and collective wisdom. Evidence shows that these ancient people exhibited intricate social systems. From the artifacts, it's obvious they formed communities of roughly 25 to 50 people, which anthropologists refer to as bands, essentially large family clusters. These were not haphazard gatherings. Instead, they were well-structured communities with kinship, ranks, and norms, and multiple strands of proof allow us to deduce this. For one, fossils show that older folks and those with disabilities existed, and skeletons of Homo erectus reveal serious wounds or illnesses that must have been crippling, healed fractures in legs, absent teeth that made chewing hard, and arthritic joints that reduced movement. These individuals lived on for many years despite their impairments, indicating that others looked after them. Caring for the frail and aged is only possible when there are strong social ties, family connections, and a duty toward the community. Another clue comes from how stone tools and raw materials were spread around. Excavated sites indicate that premium stone, perfect for crafting implements, was transported over great distances. For instance, an East African dig might yield obsidian tools whose source was 50 meters distant, and that stone was not local. It traveled there on its own. Someone transported it, either by moving it themselves or through bartering among groups. Such trade implies social connections beyond the immediate family, like trade networks and alliances, links between bands that allowed the flow of goods, and likely people as well. Next, the refined nature of their hunting methods. Bringing down large prey like elephants, hippos, and giant buffalo that wandered Africa 900,000 years ago requires teamwork. You cannot do it alone. A coordinated group is necessary, communicating clearly and sticking to a plan. Some individuals drive the animal toward an ambush, others wait to strike. Everyone knows their role and executes it at the right moment. That is structured group behavior, that is, culture. They were almost certainly using spoken language. However, we cannot know precisely what their language abilities were. Language leaves no fossils, but everything about their actions suggests they could efficiently share complex information. Teaching someone to make an Aulian hand axe involves explaining a series of steps in order. Organizing a group hunt requires real-time communication. Keeping trade connections with far-off groups requires the ability to negotiate and form agreements. Some researchers believe they had a proto-language, simpler than modern speech, but more advanced than the calls and gestures of other primates. Others think they had full language abilities, essentially the same as ours. The debate continues, but no serious scholar argues they communicated only through grunts and gestures. They were too successful for that. Their behavior was too complex. There is even preliminary evidence for symbolic thought. A few sites have yielded objects that seem to have no practical use. Stones with interesting natural patterns that were collected and carried. Shells with drilled holes, possibly used as beads or pendants. Patches of red ochre, an iron-rich mineral that yields a bright red pigment when ground and mixed with water or fat. Red ochre is especially intriguing because it appears at human sites for hundreds of thousands of years. Why did they gather it? The most common explanation is they adorned their bodies, applying pigments to skin or hair. Perhaps it served practical needs, shielding from the sun or warding off insects. But it could also have held symbolic meaning, marking someone's place in society based on rank or accomplishment, preparing for sacred events or rites. We'll never know for certain. Yet the very act of engaging in such non-vital activity with these substances hints that their thoughts reached beyond basic survival. They could also have been making art, not the elaborate cave murals that would emerge much later, but rather simpler scratches and designs. A number of scholars assert they have uncovered intentionally made geometric patterns, etched into stone or bone from that same era. Yet other experts challenge those findings, contending the markings are merely natural or coincidental. Once more, the clues are annoyingly oblique, yet they are telling. What we can state with confidence is that these individuals possessed deep inner worlds. These people did not merely live from one moment to the next. They contemplated, devised, envisioned, and maintained bonds and feelings. They nurtured their young and grieved for those who passed away. They likely held ideas of equity and righteousness, at least among their own bands. Perhaps they entertained views of existence that stretched beyond what was instantly visible proto-religious notions of spirits or powers affecting their daily lives. They thrived, And that community of 98,000 to 100,000 reproducing people marked the pinnacle of early human development up until that time. They had reached a sort of balance with the world around them. It wasn't unchanging. They continued to evolve and adapt, but it was steady and sustainable. They were able to sustain their numbers year after year, generation after generation, without exhausting resources or suffering widespread breakdown. Various parts of Africa had given rise to distinct local groups, each with subtly different adaptations. Those dwelling in Central Africa's forests likely appeared and acted a bit differently than the inhabitants of East Africa's savannas. They differed in appearance and behavior from the folk on the southern grasslands. The differences were not great enough to make them distinct species. They could all intermingle without restriction, exchange tools, and converse with one another. But they were sufficiently varied that one might likely guess a person's origin just by their appearance or the sound of their voice. This variety across regions proved to be an advantage, ensuring that humanity as a whole did not rely on just one ecosystem or food supply. If catastrophe hit one area, other communities could endure and later resettle the damaged lands. This functioned like an evolutionary safety net, distributing danger among diverse groups and habitats. The weather in their surroundings was quite mild at that time, at least compared to typical Ice Age conditions on our planet. This occurred in an interglacial phase, a short break between glacial epochs when worldwide temperatures rose and glaciers receded. Africa had no direct glaciation. Being near the equator spared it from ice sheets, even in glacial times. However, ice ages had a deep impact through shifts in precipitation. In glacial eras, Africa generally became more arid. The Sahara grew larger, rainforests contracted, and bodies of water shrank. In interglacial intervals, such as the one 900,000 years ago, rainfall increased, grasslands broadened, woodlands flourished, and waterways flowed abundantly. Animal numbers boomed, allowing human groups to flourish as well, and our forebears fully capitalized on these prosperous times. They had colonized all suitable environments and were utilizing an extensive variety of foods. They had devised technologies that turned them into skilled hunters and proficient gatherers. Their numbers were close to the maximum that the African land could sustain with Stone Age tools. In terms of evolution, they had achieved success. They were thriving. As a species, they had endured for more than 1,000,000 years and were set to carry on without end. Nothing suggested that any transformation was imminent. However, consider this about evolution and ecosystems. Triumph breeds fragility. When a species grows over-adapted to certain circumstances, overly reliant on specific assets, and too abundant compared to its surroundings, it becomes brittle. Similar to a towering card castle, magnificent in its intricacy, yet susceptible to the smallest disruption. Through their flexibility, these ancient people had attained extraordinary prosperity, yet they remained essentially reliant on the African landscape. Their survival relied on the plants and animals they foraged and hunted, as well as the dependable water sources near their campsites. The climate patterns that maintained the ecosystems they used were essential to their existence. The fairly steady conditions that enabled their population to grow to 100,000 breeding adults were crucial for them. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they had weathered dozens of climate fluctuations. They had endured multi-year droughts, cold spells that changed the plant life, and local catastrophes that upset nearby communities. Yet recovery always followed. In impacted areas, numbers might fall for a time, but elsewhere conditions held steady, and after a few generations, those local groups would recover. They had no clue that something entirely novel was approaching, unlike anything before in its scope and length. It would drive not only local groups, but the whole human species to the very edge of annihilation. They went about their daily routines, brought up their young, and crafted their implements. They adhered to the same seasonal rhythms that their forebears had observed for millennia, and then their world started to unravel. Not all at once, nor through one disastrous occurrence that annihilated groups in a single night, but gradually, inevitably. Over the course of years and decades, and then centuries, the climate started changing in unprecedented ways. The rains stopped coming and continued to stay away. Streams and springs dried out. The types of plants began to shift. Animal roots shifted or ceased altogether. And the human populace, once appearing so prosperous, so steady, so safe, started to decline. Unbeknownst to them, they were stepping into a narrow passage that would stretch for 117 millennia. They had no clue that nearly all of their kind would soon vanish. They were unaware that a mere 280 souls would carry their lineage forward. Their only aim was to make it through each day, each season, each year, carrying on as their forebears had always done. Yet success became increasingly elusive. An era of abundance was drawing to a close. The age of mere survival was dawning. Theories of catastrophe. What could wipe out 99% of the human race? We know that a terrible event struck 900 millennia ago, an event so destructive that it shrunk our ancestors' numbers to fewer than the adults in a tiny present-day village. What could it have been? What sort of disaster could push humanity to the brink of complete annihilation? Here lies both the fascination and the frustration. After decades of study, countless scientific articles, and clear genetic proof of this population crash, the cause remains a mystery. Many hypotheses exist, each chilling in its own fashion, each able to shed light on a piece of the puzzle. Yet none perfectly account for every clue. Let's explore the prime suspects, every scenario that might have erased 99% of people and nearly finished our tale before it truly started. The first theory involves a supervolcano. This is the most sensational idea, often featured in catastrophe films and keeping geologists up at night. The concept is that about 900,000 years in the past, an enormous volcanic blast occurred. An event on the order of a VEI-8 disaster ejected immense debris into the sky, causing what researchers term a volcanic winter. This is how such a scenario unfolds. A supervolcano does not simply explode. The explosion carries the power equivalent to hundreds of nuclear warheads. Immediately, the blast would wipe out all life within a radius of hundreds of miles. Yet, the most severe consequences are yet to come. Massive quantities of ash and sulfur dioxide, amounting to billions of tons, are hurled into the stratosphere and then disperse globally. That veil of aerosols doesn't merely dim the sun for a few weeks or months. Following a genuine supervolcanic event, the heavens could stay gloomy for years, possibly even decades. With no sunlight reaching the surface, temperatures drop sharply. Vegetation perishes. Those reliant on photosynthesis have no chance of survival. In just one growing cycle, the majority of plant life throughout Africa would shrivel up. The plant-eating creatures that rely on that greenery would face starvation. The carnivores that prey on those herbivores would soon meet the same fate. From the foundation upward, the whole food chain disintegrates. For our ancient ancestors, mainly scavengers and chance hunters, this scenario would be a living nightmare. Without big game to pursue or scavenge, there would be no steady supply of protein. Without plants, there would be no fallback food during hard seasons. We're talking about a famine spanning an entire continent, potentially persisting for a generation or longer. The proof supporting this idea is indirect, yet fascinating. It's a known fact that supervolcanoes have erupted during prehistoric human times. The Toba eruption in Indonesia occurred roughly 74,000 years ago, and genetic findings imply it created another minor bottleneck in the people of that time. If it took place just once, it might have occurred earlier as well. Furthermore, we know that East Africa contains rock structures showing signs of intense volcanic activity throughout the Pleistocene. The East African Rift Valley, where many of our early ancestors dwelled, is one of Earth's most volcanically active areas. It's very possible that a supervolcano erupted in or around that region about 900,000 years ago. Yet here's the issue. We have not located the decisive evidence, specifically the ash layer. When a supervolcano erupts, it leaves behind a unique geological mark. A volcanic ash layer can be detected in ice cores, lake sediments, and soil samples over broad regions. Scientists have searched for this marker from the time of 900,000 years ago. And it is not present, at least not on the scale you'd expect from an eruption powerful enough to cause such a severe bottleneck. Some researchers argue that we might have simply missed it. Geological evidence from that ancient time is incomplete, especially in tropical areas where weathering and erosion quickly remove traces. Others think the supervolcano could have been located in an unexpected place, like Antarctica, or under the ocean, where its ash would be harder to find. But without solid geological proof, the supervolcano theory remains merely a hypothesis. The second theory concerns extreme glaciation. This is the Ice Age hypothesis, based on what we know about Earth's climate during the long glacial cycles. During the Pleistocene, our planet has been alternating between ice ages and warmer interglacial periods for the last 2.6 million years. These were not minor temperature shifts. In the coldest periods of glaciation, ice sheets thousands of feet thick covered most of North America, Europe, and Northern Asia. Sea levels fell by 400 feet. Tropical rainforests shrank into small refuges, and the world became colder, drier, and far less hospitable to life. Let's explore what makes this idea so fascinating. Approximately 900 millennia ago, a deep shift occurred in our planet's climate systems. Researchers refer to this as the mid-Pleistocene transition. Prior to this era, glacial periods occurred roughly every 41,000 years. Following this shift, the cycle lengthened to about 100,000 years, and these events grew far more intense. There were more severe cold spells and hotter warm phases, with abrupt fluctuations in between, and the transition period itself was highly unstable. The climate didn't transition gradually. Instead, it experienced centuries of drastic, turbulent swings. Temperatures would drop sharply, remain bitterly cold for millennia, then unexpectedly rise high, before plummeting once more. Such swift shifts would have been catastrophic for any creature attempting to endure. The food supplies that previous generations depended on would vanish. Water supplies would either evaporate or turn to ice, and the seasonal rhythms that directed hunting and foraging would become utterly erratic. For the early inhabitants of Africa, this would have involved observing their surroundings, changing again and again within fairly brief periods of time. Sparse plains would become arid deserts, revert to grassy open land, and then shift to shrubby terrain. Bodies of water would materialize and then disappear. Herds would alter their migratory patterns or cease moving altogether. If you've built ways to survive relying on consistent cycles, and those cycles suddenly become disorderly, you would find yourself in dire straits. This explanation has more supporting proof than the supervolcano theory. Ice core samples indicate that the mid-Pleistocene transition coincided exactly with the population bottleneck. Fossil evidence reveals that numerous large mammals either vanished or suffered dramatic population declines during that time. Marine sediment records demonstrate that Africa's climate grew especially volatile approximately 900,000 years ago, with intense dry spells followed by torrential rains. Yet this hypothesis also has a flaw. Ice Age occurrences, even the most severe ones, do not usually lead to such drastic extinction bottlenecks. Unlike those other creatures that also endured similar shifts in climate, none of them suffered such severe drops in their numbers. If it's true that shifting climates alone slashed human populations by 99%, then why didn't the same happen to the other mammals roaming Africa? What made us stand out as so incredibly fragile? A number of scientists believe the explanation stems from how specialized we had become. Around 900,000 years ago, our forebears may have grown reliant on particular resources or environments. This left them especially sensitive to the changing climate. Perhaps they counted greatly on the lakeside habitats, along with the constant cycle of lakes drying up and then refilling. This threw their plans for survival into chaos, or maybe they relied on specific prey that vanished from the area, but that's only guesswork. Unfortunately, the archaeological record from that time isn't rich enough for us to be sure. The third idea is what we call the cosmic event hypothesis. Now, this one sounds like something straight out of science fiction, yet more and more researchers are giving it serious consideration. The core notion is that our planet was struck by a powerful wave of radiation originating from outer space. It could have come from a massive solar outburst, an exploding star close by, or perhaps even a gamma-ray burst. A distant star collapsing thousands of light years from us could be the source. First, let's look at solar superstorms. Our sun isn't a steady, unchanging ball of fire. It follows cycles of activity, and every so often, it unleashes enormous coronal mass ejections. These ejections hurl billions of tons of charged particles out into the cosmos. For the most part, Earth's magnetic shield keeps us safe from all that. Those particles are usually deflected away, painting the sky with stunning auroras but causing hardly any harm. However, If a really enormous solar storm collided with us at just the wrong angle, then those particles could make it down to the ground. Or if our magnetic field happened to be weaker than usual, then those particles could also make it to the ground. The consequences wouldn't be visible to the eye, but they'd be lethal. That high-energy radiation would spike cancer rates and harm our DNA, and even more urgently, it would throw the atmosphere into complete disorder. When solar particles collide with nitrogen and oxygen, they produce nitrogen oxides that break down the ozone layer. Deprived of ozone protection, the ultraviolet radiation from the sunlight would hit the Earth's surface. It would hit so intensely that it could trigger painful sunburns in just a few minutes. Vegetation would suffer harm. Any small creatures left out in the open would perish, and the whole chain of life would be thrown into chaos. Humanity would face a twofold danger. Being directly exposed to radiation would raise the rates of sickness and mortality. Yet the breakdown of food supplies would prove to be the more deadly factor. Much like what happens during a volcanic winter, the ecosystem would experience a chain reaction of failures. However, a radiation event wouldn't produce the same dramatic cooling effect that a volcanic eruption does. The climate could stay fairly steady even while surface life was battling for survival. A more extreme take on this idea includes a supernova or a gamma-ray burst. Should a star located just a few hundred light-years from us explode, the level of radiation would be worse than even the strongest solar storm. Or if a gamma-ray burst were aimed directly at Earth, the radiation would be drastically worse. This is the kind of event that could tear away huge chunks of Earth's atmosphere within just a few hours. The ozone layer would be obliterated, radiation on the ground would become deadly, and the majority of complex organisms would succumb within a few weeks. Honestly, the proof supporting this theory is quite scarce. Unless a supernova happened very near to us, there's simply no method available to directly confirm its occurrence 900,000 years ago. And even if that were the case, we would still have to locate isotopes within ice cores or ocean sediments. They are exceptionally hard to identify over such a time frame. Similarly, solar flares leave behind very little geological proof. Their impacts are visible in tree rings and ice cores dating back only a few hundred years. However, retrieving such information from 900,000 years in the past remains nearly impossible using today's tools. Still, we are aware that cosmic occurrences have influenced our planet in ancient times. Strong evidence suggests that a supernova, roughly 2.6 million years ago, might have triggered the cooling that initiated the Pleistocene ice ages. Moreover, observations of other worlds reveal that solar storms can drastically alter planetary atmospheres. Mars shed much of its atmosphere, in part due to the absence of a robust magnetic field to ward off solar winds. Thus, these processes are genuine, even if we cannot confirm that this exact incident took place. The fourth theory centers on the idea of a pandemic disease. This is the stuff of biological nightmares. It is the notion that a pathogen, whether virus or bacterium, swept across human communities, infecting and killing almost everyone it touched. This was similar to the Black Death or smallpox, but far more lethal, and striking long before our ancestors had any medical understanding. And here lies the chilling reason behind this theory. Outbreaks of illness can be alarmingly efficient at decimating populations, particularly among small and widely dispersed communities. Contemporary instances demonstrate just how rapidly epidemics can propagate. The influenza pandemic of 1918 infected 1/3 of the global population in under 2 years. HIV/AIDS claimed tens of millions of lives before effective treatments were found, and these outbreaks occurred within societies that had modern healthcare and worldwide communication. We need a basic grasp of how diseases spread. Just envision a similar epidemic striking tiny groups of early humans who had no notion of germs or isolation measures. Rather than being separated, a sick person would stay with their family, and their care would pass the illness to all in the community. When relatives traveled to nearby communities for exchange or gatherings, they brought the infectious agent along. In just one season, an illness might sweep over an entire landmass. To explain the genetic bottleneck evidence, the illness had to be both deadly and very easy to catch. Such a disease would have to be 98 to 99% fatal, yet it would progress gradually so that isolated groups in remote safe havens could escape infection altogether. It's a slim chance from an epidemiology standpoint, but not out of the question. Ebola, for instance, can be very deadly, but needs proximity to transmit. Measles, on the other hand, spreads like wildfire, but isn't as lethal. A germ combining extreme contagiousness and high fatality could theoretically cause the population collapse we're investigating. Our DNA holds intriguing clues that are hard to ignore. In modern humans, we see marks of ancient natural selection on immunity genes, hinting that our ancestors underwent intense disease pressure. Scientists have detected what they describe as immune system sweeps, times when evolution quickly boosted particular immune genes at the expense of others. One such sweep seems to have taken place roughly during the period of the bottleneck. This indicates that illness played a key role in determining who lived and who died. However, there's a catch with the pandemic idea. Illnesses don't turn into fossils, and we can't directly identify a microbe from 900,000 years ago. Even using today's advanced DNA sequencing, extracting genetic traces from ancient organisms is extremely challenging. We have successfully read the DNA of plague from medieval bones and influenza from 100-year-old tissue. But that's still a far cry from the time span we need to cover. Our best option is to study selection patterns in current human populations and then reason backward to guess which illnesses might have existed. But there is yet another problem to consider. The vast majority of human epidemic diseases stem from animals that were domesticated. Measles originates from cattle, influenza from pigs and birds, and smallpox likely from camels. However, 900,000 years ago, early humans had not yet domesticated any animals and were still living as hunter-gatherers. So, where could a human-specific epidemic disease possibly come from? It would have to be a pathogen that transferred directly from wild animals to humans, discovering that we are excellent hosts. Then it would spread rapidly through our populations. Not impossible, but less likely than the zoonotic diseases that have afflicted us since the agricultural revolution. The fifth theory is rapid climate oscillation. Imagine the glaciation theory, but amplified to an extreme degree. The key idea is, instead of one massive catastrophe or a slow, gradual climate shift, a series of rapid, violent swings between different climate states. Decade-long droughts, followed by immense floods, and temperature surges that turned grasslands into deserts. Then abrupt cooling that regenerated forests, with changes occurring so quickly that no species could fully adapt. This theory is based on evidence in climate records around the mid-Pleistocene transition. Ice cores and ocean sediments reveal something scientists call high-frequency variability. That is a technical way of saying the climate was behaving in an extremely chaotic manner. Within a single human lifetime, average temperatures could shift by 10 degrees Celsius. Rainfall patterns could alternate from drought to deluge and back. But these were not slow changes taking millennia. They were rapid shocks. Occurring every few decades, for early humans this meant survival strategies that worked for their parents might be useless by the time they had children. Crops that sustained a community for a decade could vanish in the following one. The water supplies your tribe relied on might run dry, compelling relentless movement into unfamiliar lands. Game animals could alter their migratory routes or disappear from the area entirely. It was impossible to form specialized survival tactics, since the environment was never stable long enough for such approaches to succeed. This forms an ecological phenomenon called the extinction vortex. A drop in population due to a single environmental shock lessens genetic variety, leaving the group more susceptible to the following shock. Every subsequent disaster strikes a more diminished and fragile group, until eventually the count is so low that mere luck could extinguish them. This aligns perfectly with the evidence found in genetic data. A group that contracted swiftly and remained tiny for more than 100 millennia, indicating not one cataclysm, but ongoing strain across many generations. Among the 5 theories, this one likely has the most compelling evidence. Climatic data clearly demonstrates severe fluctuations during the Middle Pleistocene transition. It is known that this instability impacted Africa, the primary home of early humans. Fossil evidence reveals that other creatures were likewise under strain during this era, but none suffered as intensely as humans. The timing aligns flawlessly. The climatic upheaval initiates exactly as the population bottleneck begins and persists for approximately equal length. However, the climate variability hypothesis has a flaw of its own. It fails to account for why humans were impacted far more severely than other animals. Admittedly, climatic instability is challenging for all species. Yet for it to trigger a 99% population collapse exclusively in humans indicates that we were somehow especially susceptible. Perhaps we grew overly specialized, heavily reliant on specific resources or environments. It's possible that our bigger brains and longer childhoods reduced our ability to adapt swiftly to shifting circumstances. Perhaps it was mere misfortune that the particular shifts that happened struck hardest the resources we relied upon. We can make conjectures, yet we lack certainty. What is both irritating and intriguing about these hypotheses is this: they aren't contradictory to one another. Indeed, the most plausible scenario is that various elements merged to form a perfect storm of extinction forces. Perhaps it began with the mid-Pleistocene transition triggering climatic upheaval. Then a supervolcano exploded, or a solar storm struck, turning a difficult situation into a catastrophe. Amid the turmoil, a disease swept through the frail, dispersed groups, wiping out many of the remaining. By itself, each separate factor may not have been sufficient to trigger a 99% reduction in population. But all of them occurring together in a fairly brief span could undoubtedly achieve that. Experts refer to this as a compound disaster, several independent catastrophes that coincidentally cluster, magnifying one another's impacts. Imagine being struck by an earthquake, followed by a tsunami, then a pandemic, all within a single 10-year period. Individually, each would be dreadful, but combined they become civilization-ending, or in this instance, species-ending. We might never discover precisely what occurred 900 millennia ago. The proof is too piecemeal, the temporal scales too immense, the geologic archive too spotty. What remains certain is that something drove our species to the very edge of annihilation. Our numbers shrank to such a tiny size that extinction seemed inevitable. The very fact that we exist now shows that, against all conceivable odds, a small group of survivors discovered a path to carry on. They endured over 100 millennia of suffering that wiped out 99% of their kind. While the direct evidence may have vanished into the past, the scar remains etched into our genetic code. Each person living on Earth today bears the genetic fingerprint of that primeval disaster. Every one of us is a descendant of those approximately 1,280 survivors who managed to endure humanity's most severe crisis. The tale of their suffering, their means of survival, and the price they paid is a mystery we continue to assemble. Using scattered pieces of evidence spanning over 1,000,000 years, the Dark Age stretched 117,000 years on the verge of annihilation. That is, 117,000 years. Take a moment to truly grasp that. Not merely 117 days or 117 months, but 117,000 years of clinging to existence by the slimmest margin. That amounts to 550 human generations, each waking each day in a reality where their whole species might vanish. This was due to one harsh season, one outbreak of disease, one unfortunate meeting with predators. For perspective, all of documented human history from the earliest cities in Mesopotamia to the landing on the moon covers merely around 5,000 years. This population bottleneck extended 23 times longer. If you attempted to count 117,000 years in seconds, that would require 3.7 years of continuous counting. This is simply to tally the duration until our species ceased being effectively extinct. This occurred throughout those many millennia. The world's entire human population was fewer than the capacity of an average present-day high school. Specifically, there were only 280 individuals. This was not merely a single village. It was just a handful of family clans, perhaps 4 or 5, striving to keep an entire species alive across a vast continent. Imagine the weight of that responsibility. In those dark times, it's likely that every person alive on Earth knew, or at least knew of, every other person. When a life ended, it was never just a number, and it was a devastating blow to all of humanity. And when a child was born, the entire human population rejoiced. For that new life meant the species had grown by nearly 0.1%. The loneliness they felt must have been overwhelming in ways we can scarcely comprehend. We humans are deeply social beings, and our nature is to thrive in communities of hundreds, even thousands. Our minds are designed to nurture intricate social webs, to exchange stories and knowledge, and to learn from a variety of mentors and examples. Yet during that bottleneck, such diversity of communities simply did not exist. Only a small group of desperate survivors remained, likely gathered in 2 or 3 remote sanctuaries. At most, each group contained just a few hundred souls. From the clues left in the earth and in our genes, it appears these last refuges were most probably in equatorial Africa. Within the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, this area had a number of advantages that would allow survival even during the harshest climate extremes. Deep lakes that never completely dried up, even through prolonged droughts, and cave networks offered protection from scorching heat and bitter cold. Varied landscapes gave rise to small, localized climates, and tiny pockets where conditions remained bearable while all around, the land became impossible to inhabit. A number of scientists propose that a second refuge group existed even further south, perhaps in the area we now call South Africa, close to the Cape. In this region, there are signs that humans lived there, without interruption, throughout the bottleneck time. Because it sat along the coast, this refuge offered a steady supply of seafood when land-based food became scarce. Yet, whether the number of safe havens was 2 or 3, the situation remained unchanged. Each tiny band lived in total isolation, cut off from the others. Moving from one refuge to another would have been extremely perilous, requiring journeys of hundreds of miles through harsh, barren landscapes. Many of these groups likely passed years, even decades, without meeting any other humans beyond their own close-knit community. Such isolation led to genetic difficulties that posed nearly as great a danger to survival as the environmental catastrophe. With a total population of just 1,800 people, split into several distinct groups. For any one group, the number of individuals capable of breeding could have been as few as 200. This was a genetic disaster waiting to happen. Every person carries within them a number of harmful recessive genes. These mutations cause no trouble if you have only one copy, but become dangerous or deadly when 2 copies are inherited. In a large community, such genes stay uncommon because the odds of 2 carriers coming together to have children are quite small. But in a very small group where everyone is related, the likelihood of inheriting 2 copies of a harmful gene surges dramatically. Within just a few generations, the survivors of the bottleneck would have begun to notice this effect. Birth anomalies that are uncommon in typical populations would have become frequent. Genetic conditions that normally occur in 1 out of every 10,000 babies could have appeared in 1 out of 50. Each family group would have included individuals with developmental issues, weakened immune defenses, or subtle yet serious genetic vulnerabilities. It's likely that certain genetic lines died out completely. This could happen if a family encountered extraordinary misfortune from illness or accidents, losing every child before they could start families of their own. Those precise gene variations were lost forever, taking with them potential future advantages and genetic variety that might have proved valuable later on. Those who endured were forced to make harsh decisions. Inbreeding was unavoidable, but they probably created social customs to reduce the most severe impacts. Restrictions on the closest forms of incest, parent-child, and sibling pairings likely did not originate from moral reasoning. Instead, they originated from the empirical observation that such unions yield too many offspring that cannot survive. Certain groups might have done so. They undertook dangerous travels to other displaced communities, specifically to find spouses from outside their lineage, exchanging sons and daughters to preserve genetic variety. Yet in spite of these approaches, genetic harm kept accumulating, and every new generation saw the human gene pool shrink a little more. Uncommon genetic variants disappeared through sheer chance, a phenomenon called genetic drift. When a population is large, genetic drift has minimal effect because rare genes are carried by thousands of individuals. But within a group of 1,280 people, a scarce gene might have only 10 or 20 carriers. If those particular individuals happen not to reproduce, or if their children all died young, that gene vanished forever. The marks of this genetic wear are still visible in modern human DNA. Humans have notably low genetic diversity compared to other great apes. Chimpanzees, even though their total populations are much smaller today, have 3 to 4 times more genetic variation than humans do. 2 chimpanzees from the same forest in Africa differ more genetically from each other than any 2 humans anywhere on Earth. This shortage of diversity makes us vulnerable as a species, and it's why diseases that other primates easily shake off can devastate human populations. That's also why we show much less variation in traits like immune response, metabolic efficiency, and resistance to environmental toxins. The population bottleneck didn't merely shrink our count, it also diminished our evolutionary possibilities. This narrowing limited the genetic resources we could rely on when facing upcoming difficulties. However, those who survived weren't concerned with the distant evolutionary impacts. Their attention was fixed on surviving the coming season, the following year, and the next generation. That everyday hardship was so severe that it would overwhelm most people today in just a few weeks. Picture yourself as one of those survivors from the population bottleneck. You dwell in a modest network of caves with roughly 30 others from 3 or 4 family units, united because being alone meant certain death. Other caves are taken by competing bands that you steer clear of, since fighting for scarce resources could annihilate both sides. Each morning begins with the identical concern: what food can we find today? The large animals that your grandparents once hunted have largely vanished, either becoming extinct or moving far away. Hunting big game is an uncommon and risky endeavor, endangering the lives of hunters your community cannot spare. So you turn your attention to smaller creatures: rodents, birds, lizards, anything you can capture with minimal risk. Edible plants are limited and available only during certain seasons because the erratic climate disrupted the typical cycles of plant growth. Species that once consistently yielded nuts or fruits now fail in most years. Your community has adapted to consume foods that earlier generations would have turned away. Bitter roots require lengthy preparation before they can be safely eaten. Insects offer protein but demand many hours of collection to gather a meaningful amount. Tree bark and roots were consumed during the harshest periods. During the worst times, such foods supplied just enough calories to offset the effort of collecting them. The availability of water remains a perpetual worry, and those lakes and streams that once sustained your forebears can no longer be counted upon. In certain years, the waters run as they always did, but in other seasons, they vanish entirely, leaving your band no choice but to anxiously excavate the parched channels, searching for moisture beneath the surface. Death from lack of water is a common fate, striking the aged and the little ones whose frames are too weak to endure thirst. Illness is a perpetual threat, because you all exist in tight proximity. Sickness passes quickly through your tiny community. Your numbers are insufficient to sustain the usual plagues, so measles, smallpox, and other outbreaks that need many hosts to survive have not yet emerged. Yet parasites, microbes, and fungal afflictions lurk everywhere. Dirty water brings diarrhea, and wounds quickly get infected and often lead to death. During the cold months, lung ailments claim the fragile, and since your clan is so tiny, there are no dedicated healers, no knowledgeable specialists. Not a single person can devote themselves fully to advancing medicine or refining cures, and each individual must participate in the daily struggle to stay alive. The individual who could have been a gifted herbalist in a bigger community must instead dedicate time to foraging, crafting, and treating animal skins. Wisdom builds at a glacial pace, and if a person dies suddenly, their unique expertise may vanish along with them. A similar difficulty plagues technological advances. The march of human achievement is meant to be cumulative, with every generation learning from those before and making enhancements. Yet among roughly 280 souls, technical know-how is easily lost, and a dry spell might wipe out an entire clan. And along with them, disappear the secrets for crafting implements, locating healing herbs, or preparing food. Your forefathers possessed greater knowledge than you, a terrifying thought that must have tormented the survivors of that genetic bottleneck. Those who faced the crisis had once been part of thriving communities numbering hundreds of thousands. They possessed advanced tool-making skills, deep understanding of their surroundings, and intricate social systems. But when the population plummeted, that pool of knowledge began to break apart. Imagine owning tools crafted by your grandmother, implements you can no longer perfectly recreate because she passed away before passing on all her crafting secrets. You might recall tales of rich hunting areas, yet nobody alive remembers the path to get there. You may hold vague cultural memories of festivals and ceremonies that were meaningful in larger groups, but feel pointless when your entire world is just 40 people, spread across 3 cave systems. This erosion of cultural wisdom made bouncing back far more difficult. Even if the environment grew favorable and the rains came back and plants regrew, your tiny group couldn't use those resources because knowledge was lost. Earlier generations may have used coordinated fire drive hunting methods that need dozens of hunters working together. But with only 5 or 6 adult men in your band, those methods are useless, so you must create new approaches suited for smaller numbers. Tool production faces the same difficulty, as creating fine stone tools demands specialized expertise and hundreds of hours of practice to perfect. In a large population, you can have dedicated experts focusing on tool making while others hunt and gather. But in your small group, everyone must be average at everything. The tools are functional but rough, good enough to survive but not to flourish. The emotional strain of that population collapse must have been nearly too much to endure. These were not simply people fighting for mere existence. They were individuals who sensed, at least subconsciously, that their entire kind was in decline. They could observe that their numbers had diminished compared to earlier times. Their grandparents passed down tales of eras when far more inhabitants dwelled in that area. They discovered deserted camps and rock shelters bearing traces of earlier human life. Yet these places lay vacant and quiet. Imagine closing your eyes each evening, being aware that should your own family unit perish, should illness ravage your cave, should a sudden flood engulf them all, if a big predator attacks your hunters, the human species might never bounce back, and that burden must have felt overwhelming. Each choice could potentially wipe out the entire species. Should we venture into that valley in search of sustenance? Or is the danger of losing our hunters too high? Should we battle that competing band for control of the water supply? Or would the struggle leave both sides too weak to recover? Kids raised in that era of scarcity faced perpetual grief. Many likely saw brothers and sisters taken by illness or mishap. Numerous children lost their parents and were brought up by aunts, uncles, or more distant kin. The conventional family model we consider ordinary 2 parents jointly raising several kids was likely rare back then. Broader family networks divided the duties of raising children, since no individual nuclear family could bear the risk of putting all parental effort into just one union. Youth was short-lived. By the age of 7 or 8, children were already helping significantly with collecting food. By their early teenage years, they functioned as complete adults, for the community could not sustain unproductive individuals beyond the most essential period. Learning revolved solely around skills needed for survival, techniques for locating water, recognizing safe plants, sparking flames, crafting simple implements, interpreting animal footprints, and steering clear of predators. There simply wasn't any opportunity for the kind of exploratory play that fosters development. The creative spark found in children of today. Art, music, and storytelling were cut down to the absolute basics needed to pass along essential knowledge. What archaeologists term symbolic artifacts are strikingly missing from the archaeological record of the Bottleneck period. No cave paintings, ornamental objects, or any evidence of rituals or ceremonies existed. This does not imply that these people had less intelligence. It simply reflects their desperation, leaving no energy for anything not directly tied to immediate survival. And yet, somehow, they endured for 550 generations. These minuscule populations held tightly to their fragile existence. They saw their numbers balance on the edge of extinction. Periodic collapses occurred when disease or unfavorable seasons reduced them even more. They likely experienced decades when deaths exceeded births, and the human population fell below that crucial 280 person mark. However, they never fully disappeared. Some groups discovered ways to keep just enough genetic diversity to prevent a complete collapse from inbreeding. Certain populations managed to sustain sporadic contact with others, exchanging members occasionally to rejuvenate their genetic pools. A few individuals proved sufficiently adaptable, resourceful, and fortunate to survive and produce offspring. The recovery stretched over such a long period, partly due to biological factors. Once a population drops below a certain size, growth becomes exponential but very gradual. Even when conditions grow better, even if each breeding pair successfully raises 2 or 3 children to adulthood, The pace at which a population can grow depends heavily on how many females are of childbearing age. Out of a total of around 1,280 individuals, perhaps only 300 are females in their reproductive years. If each of those females bears 3 offspring across her lifespan, and every child grows up to have their own children, then after 1 generation, the population rises to roughly 1,900. In the following generation, it climbs to around 2,800, and then to about 4,200 thereafter. That might sound like solid progress, but keep in mind that each span of a generation lasts roughly 2 decades. Thus, even after 60 years of ideal circumstances, the population has merely grown from 1,280 to 4,200. At that point, the species remains functionally extinct, vulnerable to being entirely erased by just one volcanic event or a single outbreak of disease. Only after many centuries of uninterrupted expansion does a population finally reach a size that offers stability. Yet throughout the bottleneck period, perfect conditions never lasted for multiple centuries in a row. What actually happened were short intervals of recovery, each soon interrupted by fresh climatic catastrophes that pushed the numbers back down. The natural environment was, in itself, an obstacle to any recovery. Even once the most severe phase of the crisis had ended, Africa's climate stayed erratic and unpredictable. The very forces that had originally caused the bottleneck volcanic eruptions, weaker monsoon cycles, and chaotic ocean currents persisted. For tens of thousands of years, these elements kept disturbing global weather patterns, and drought conditions were still frequent. The availability of food sources continued to be unreliable. The people who survived could never rely on stable circumstances persisting for the time needed to achieve meaningful population increase. However, the most critical issue may have been the disappearance of what biologists refer to as ecological release. Under ordinary evolutionary circumstances, once a species acquires effective adaptations, its numbers surge quickly until they hit the environment's carrying capacity. But for those who lived through the bottleneck, carrying capacity was never met because the carrying capacity itself was constantly falling apart. Whenever the population began increasing, the environment would once again worsen, causing that growth to collapse. This cycle persisted for more than 100 millennia, and short spells of growth were always succeeded by catastrophic declines. Gradual progress was frequently broken by massive die-offs, and it's likely that human numbers rose and fell many times throughout that narrow period. Human numbers swung back and forth from 800 to 2,000 people, never managing the consistent increase essential to leave the risky phase. Genetic data indicates that at least 3 or 4 significant times, our ancestors almost vanished entirely during that era. These were moments when the number of humans fell so drastically that today's genetic researchers can spot the mark in our genes. Abrupt declines in genetic variety serve as markers for severe population crashes. On every occasion, a sufficient number of individuals managed to survive, preserving the species. Yet on each such occasion, a fraction more genetic variation was lost. Uncommon genetic traits faded away, and humanity's collective gene pool became less diverse. Through every trial, those who lived on persevered, witnessing their offspring face hardship and laying their loved ones to rest. When circumstances grew unbearable, they moved, leaving ancestral lands behind in pursuit of areas that could sustain them. They adjusted their tools, their eating habits, and their community arrangements whatever was needed to eke out just a few additional years of existence. They lacked the reassurance that their suffering would one day come to a close. They had no way of foreseeing that 117,000 years later, their offspring would count in the billions. In their eyes, this was simply existence, the endless effort, the fragile equilibrium, the everyday unpredictability that had become routine. Ancient tales of plentiful days probably felt like legends, reassuring falsehoods that the older generation shared to inspire hope. Yet those 5,850 generations of survivors achieved something extraordinary. They forged a genetic sieve that would forever alter the course of humankind. During the genetic bottleneck, nature picked out certain characteristics, and being smart became crucial because staying alive meant always finding solutions. Working together was rewarded since loners didn't last long. The ability to adapt behavior was prized, because sticking to one plan didn't work when everything kept shifting. The knack for coming up with new ideas became important, as old wisdom was constantly forgotten and needed to be reinvented. Those early humans who made it through the bottleneck were far more than simple survivors. They carried the bloodline of the most flexible, cleverest, and most socially skilled individuals of their kind. Shaped by more than 100,000 years of the harshest natural selection our species has ever known, each one of us living today still holds the genetic legacy that made it through that brutal sieve. These genetic variations were put to the test in the furnace of near annihilation and showed they could withstand the unbearable. Yet, the most immediate inheritance was plain and grim. After 117,000 years of fighting for every day, humanity was at last prepared to start rebuilding. The weather patterns were finally settling down. Food became more dependable, and the battered, shrunken population was ready to slowly crawl back from the edge of extinction. That dark age was drawing to a close. Yet the species that came out of it would carry permanent scars from those 1,000 years spent teetering on the brink. The comeback. How our ancestors dragged themselves up from the abyss. About 813,000 years back, a shift occurred. The climate that had almost wiped out humankind started to calm down. It wasn't sudden or dramatic, just a slow, barely noticeable change at first. The terrible droughts grew fewer, and the wild temperature shifts became milder. For the survivors scattered across their dwindling safe havens in Africa, the ecosystem that had been battered by more than 100,000 years of turmoil began to recover. That change was absolutely everything. Keep in mind, we're not talking about huge groups of people here. According to genetic clues, the number of people able to reproduce stayed at or under 1,280 for 117,000 years. That's like a tiny village scattered all over a whole continent. Each arrival was treasured, while each passing was devastating. No room for mistakes existed whatsoever. Yet now, for the first time within the recollections of the living, even within their grandparents' recollections, across the memories of forebears reaching back countless generations, the world was gradually turning more welcoming, and humankind started to react. The process of recovery didn't occur in a single night, nor was it like a movie scene where survivors step out of a shelter into a radiant new world. The journey from the brink of extinction back to stable population numbers required many millennia, a gradual, arduous, and unpredictable advancement, interrupted by downturns and localized disappearances. Yet the direction was clear. Humanity was desperately climbing back from the edge of oblivion. Proof of this resurgence is embedded in our genetic code, much like chapters in a historical record. By examining the variety within the human genome, researchers detect signs of demographic growth starting roughly 813 millennia ago. The signal is faint yet unmistakable. As fresh genetic variations emerge at a higher rate, the speed at which mutations build up increases, and the traces pointing to population compressions start to vanish. Imagine it this way. Amid the constriction, the collective human gene pool resembled a library stripped of the majority of its volumes. Just the most crucial writings were preserved, guides for survival that had demonstrated their value in the harshest conceivable circumstances. However, as the populace grew, fresh records began to be created. Genetic mutations, those spontaneous alterations in DNA that occur with each generation, started to build up once more. Not all such changes were advantageous. The majority had no particular effect, but a handful turned out to be detrimental, yet when considered together, they signified something far deeper. The variety within the gene pool was gradually making a comeback, and such genetic variety served as a kind of survival policy for the entire species. In the time of the population squeeze, our ancestors were frighteningly exposed to every fresh danger. A single new illness, another climatic upheaval, or an evolutionary cul-de-sac might have spelled the end. Yet with every successive generation of growth, as each beneficial genetic change endured and disseminated, our species steadily forged greater resilience. The reservoir of genetic material was becoming richer and more varied, and the possible paths forward were increasing in number. Over just several millennia, the number of reproducing individuals likely expanded twofold and then doubled one more time. Sadly, the physical clues left from that era are excruciatingly limited. It's like searching for tiny needles within haystacks the size of entire continents, and those haystacks are close to 1 million years old. Nonetheless, the few locations we have uncovered reveal a tale of slow, steady spreading. Collections of stone implements begin to surface in areas where none had existed for thousands of years. Caves that bore no traces of human activity during the population crash now hold signs of consistent habitation. Those who endured began to fan out once more, reoccupying lands. These were places their forebears had left behind, yet the new inhabitants were not identical to those who had almost vanished. The intense population reduction had altered them profoundly, with consequences that would define the entire course of human development. The force of natural selection, working at peak pressure for more than 100 millennia, had imprinted itself indelibly upon our genetic makeup. Those who made it through weren't simply fortunate. They possessed unique qualities. Let's explore what likely transpired across those harsh millennia. Some characteristics that were only useful before the disaster turned into critical necessities, with intelligence being a clear example. They could tackle unfamiliar challenges and discover new food supplies when the usual ones vanished. They needed to recall intricate details about seasonal cycles and where resources were found, along with the importance of working together. During severe shortages, communities that collaborated well gained major benefits over those that did not. They shared meals in difficult periods, organized hunts for rare animals, and looked after the ill and wounded rather than leaving them behind. This population pinch would have strongly favored those with a cooperative nature. Clans that fell apart under stress or turned to fighting over dwindling supplies likely perished. Our ancient ancestors learned to remain united, even as everything crumbled around them. Moreover, they possessed the ability to innovate during tough times, and evidence from that era reveals something astonishing. Even with a devastating drop in numbers and resources more limited than before, stone tool craftsmanship actually grew more advanced. The crude, essential tools used by early humans for eons were giving way to more refined and task-specific instruments. These included meticulously crafted axes, blades with exact flaking patterns, and items meant for particular jobs instead of all-around use. This was no coincidence. It was a process of adjusting via creative thinking. Those who endured could examine a difficulty and devise original ways to overcome it. They could repurpose known materials, master complicated methods, and crucially, pass this knowledge to their peers. At this point, spoken communication likely became absolutely vital. Showing someone how to knock rocks together can be taught by example. However, instructing in the precise skills for crafting specialized tools, identifying superior stone sources, and grasping the characteristics of various rock types requires more. This demands a form of communication that is detailed, exact, and conceptual, the sort that only a complex language can provide. Genetic data indicates that the bottleneck put strong evolutionary pressure on the development of language-related brain structures. Genes responsible for speech generation and language comprehension exhibit evidence of intense natural selection precisely at that time. Nature was actively selecting those who possessed better communication skills. The line between survival and extinction was extremely fine. In such a world, being able to pass on information could decide whether one lived or died. Thus, the humans that came out of the bottleneck were more than mere survivors. They represented a new breed of human more intelligent, collaborative, creative, and eloquent than those who came before. This crisis shaped and sharpened humanity in a way that nothing else ever has, before or after. As the numbers started to grow, these characteristics spread along with the population. Each fresh generation bore the genetic inheritance of having survived the bottleneck. Every new group that branched away from expanding communities carried the cultural wisdom that had allowed survival against all odds. Around 700,000 years ago, perhaps 100,000 years after the recovery began, the human population likely numbered in the tens of thousands. That was still minuscule. Compared to today, the whole human species could have been seated in a medium-sized sports arena. But in contrast to 1,280, this was a remarkable achievement, and the growth was speeding up. Now, this is where the story becomes truly fascinating. As human numbers increased and they dispersed throughout Africa, they started to experience a variety of environments that were unavailable during the bottleneck. The survivors had held on in just a few refuges, likely river valleys and coastal regions where water was consistently present. but their offspring were moving out into savannas, forests, and mountain ranges. Varied climate regions, distinct ecosystems, fresh hurdles, and new possibilities, the diverse environment triggered a phenomenon known to geneticists as the founder effect. Tiny bands broke off from the main group and established themselves in unknown lands. Each new founding group possessed only a fraction of the total genetic diversity that existed in the original population. Each encountered distinct survival challenges in their new settings, and some bands adapted to hot, dry grasslands and became more efficient at preserving water. Other groups traveled to cooler, wetter regions where different survival abilities were required, and a few became experts in hunting large animals. Some gained mastery in fishing or gathering plants for food, and this marked the very beginning of human population structure. They were not separate species, but each group had unique genetic traits, cultural customs, and survival strategies. This blend of unity and diversity would become a defining characteristic of humanity. Everyone shared the common heritage of surviving the population bottleneck, but each community added its own variations to that shared story. Artifacts from this era reveal an increasing level of technological sophistication, and stone tools became more refined, more specialized, and more skillfully crafted. Even more importantly, they began to show regional differences. Stone tool collections from East Africa appear different from those in South Africa, which in turn differ from North African ones. This is no accident. It points to the emergence of distinct cultural traditions. Groups developed their own ways of doing things and passed down technical knowledge through generations. This is the mark of true culture, not just instinct or individual learning, but socially shared knowledge that can build up and improve over time. Those who survived the bottleneck carried their culture with them through the crisis. Their offspring were now broadening it, refining it, forming fresh cultural customs, and adjusting to new surroundings. Roughly 600,000 years back, some 300,000 years after the recovery began, humankind crossed another important milestone. It is at this time that we first detect signs of what would later be known as Homo heidelbergensis, a species regarded by numerous anthropologists as the last common ancestor of contemporary humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans. The classification at this point becomes intricate and debatable. Certain scientists believe Homo heidelbergensis was a separate species. Others argue it's merely a term we use for a transitional phase in human evolution. Various groups were parting ways but had not yet formed distinct species. But no matter what name we give them, the people alive roughly 600,000 years ago were markedly distinct from the ones who had gone through the population bottleneck. These humans possessed bigger brains, around 200 cubic centimeters on average, compared to approximately 900 for early Homo erectus. Their craniums were rounder, their faces protruded less, their physiques were more slender, less sturdy, and most critically, their behavior was more advanced. Digs from that era reveal indications of managed fire utilization. This goes beyond simply using natural blazes when they occurred. It involves intentional fire creation and upkeep. This is a major development. Fire brings heat, defense against predators, and the capacity to cook meals, which improves digestion and unlocks additional nutrients. It lengthens the daytime, enabling tasks once night falls. It establishes a social hub where communities assemble, exchange food, and recount tales. The rise of consistent fire usage indicates that these humans from after the bottleneck had grown the mental capacities and cultural traditions. These were needed to sustain intricate technologies through successive generations. Starting a fire is no simple task. It demands particular understanding, particular resources, particular methods. You must acquire this skill from someone who already possesses it, and then pass it on to the following generation. At its core, this is what cultural transmission truly looks like. There are also signs pointing to increasingly advanced methods of hunting. At kill sites, we find the remains of several large animals, hinting at well-organized group hunts. Marks left by butchery on bones reveal a systematic approach to processing carcasses, ensuring every bit of nutrition was obtained. The act of carrying supplies from one spot to another is this movement of resources across long distances. This suggests forethought and the ability to delay immediate rewards. These early humans had moved beyond simply responding to whatever happened in the moment. They were thinking ahead, preparing for future requirements, and orchestrating elaborate group tasks. Their minds were now capable of abstract thought about time and cause and effect. What is perhaps most striking, genetic data indicates that at this point human groups started down the path that would one day result in the formation of new species. Recall that the population bottleneck had left all individuals with very similar genetic makeup. Every survivor was a close relative, each one carrying nearly the same DNA. However, as these groups grew and dispersed throughout Africa, and later beyond its borders, they started to develop genetic variations. Different groups encountered distinct environmental pressures that influenced their survival. A genetic change that proved beneficial in one habitat could be ineffective or even detrimental elsewhere. Gradually, these variations built up over generations, but they were still not sufficient to produce distinct species at that point. It would require many more hundreds of thousands of years for that to happen. Yet it was enough to establish population structure and genetic diversity, the essential ingredients for new species to arise in the distant future. Around 500,000 years ago, the human population across Africa likely counted several 100,000 individuals. The comeback from the brink of annihilation was practically finished. Mankind had pulled itself away from the edge of disaster and was once more flourishing. Yet the lingering shadow of that population crash still hung overhead. The human gene pool, despite everything, after 500,000 years of population growth, it remained much poorer than before the catastrophe. That vanished genetic variety could never be completely restored. Every person alive now, every one of the 8 billion, holds less genetic diversity than a single group of chimpanzees. This is the lasting scar that the population crash imprinted on our kind. Yet if the bottleneck stripped something from us, it also granted something in return. Those 117 millennia of evolutionary stress had shaped a novel form of human. They were smarter, more collaborative, more inventive, more talkative than any prior hominins. The cost was almost total annihilation. The gain was the characteristics that would later enable humankind to reign over the earth. Roughly 400,000 years back, human groups started spreading outside Africa for the first occasion after the population crash. Small bands ventured into the Middle East, and later into Europe and Asia. These initial journeys planted the seeds for the groups that would eventually turn into Neanderthals in Europe and Denisovans in Asia. However, the principal African population stayed put, still evolving along its own path. These were the forebears of Homo sapiens. We are the progeny of those who lived through the population crash. Those who remained in Africa adjusted to the varied and demanding landscapes of the continent where humankind began. Over the subsequent several hundred millennia, that African populace kept nurturing the features that would come to characterize contemporary humans. What we find in the archaeological evidence points to a gradual rise in complexity and refinement. Stone implements grew lighter, keener, more effective. Excavation sites reveal signs of orderly living quarters, zones set aside for crafting tools, preparing food, and resting. Fireplaces were used for cooking meals and providing warmth. 300,000 years in the past, we begin to uncover the oldest fossils that appear unmistakably modern. These fossils have tall domed craniums, faces that rest flat under the brain case instead of jutting out, and slender bone structure. These represent the earliest remains of Homo sapiens, and they're found solely on the African continent. During the following 250 millennia, anatomically modern humans stayed in Africa, still evolving, still inventing. From this era, archaeological findings reveal the rise of more and more complex behaviors. The earliest clear proof of art appears ochre crayons for drawing, meticulously shaped bone tools, and shell beads worn as personal decorations. There was systematic use of pigments and signs of trade routes that transported materials across hundreds of miles. They were no longer merely trying to survive. They were building culture, forging identities, and communicating through symbols. Then, roughly 60,000 years in the past, a shift occurred. A small band of modern humans departed from Africa and moved into the Middle East. This was not the initial occasion that humans ventured out of Africa. Recall that Neanderthal and Denisovan predecessors had migrated much earlier, hundreds of millennia before. However, this exodus was unlike any before. These pioneers brought with them the entire suite of advanced behaviors that had evolved in Africa over 300,000 years. Moreover, they possessed demographic and technological edges that allowed fast expansion. In just 40,000 years, they had spread to all parts of the planet except Antarctica. In Europe, they either replaced or merged with the Neanderthals. In Asia, they mixed with the Denisovans through interbreeding. They sailed across oceans to arrive in Australia. They traversed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, and wherever they ventured, they carried the genetic heritage of the population bottleneck. Every human living now descends directly from those 1,800 survivors who held on to life nearly 1,000,000 years in the past. We bear their DNA and inherit the characteristics that natural selection honed throughout those harsh millennia. All those traits, intelligence, creativity, cooperation, language, were hammered out in the furnace of near annihilation. Getting past the bottleneck meant more than simply bringing the population back to where it was before the disaster. It was about humankind coming out of that ordeal deeply changed, tougher, cleverer, and far more adaptable. That crisis almost wiped us out, yet what survived made us utterly different from any creature that had lived before. We had dragged ourselves back from the edge of the abyss. In the process, we turned into a new kind of being, never seen before, one that, for good or ill, would completely remodel the earth. Human dominance didn't start with farming, cities, or civilization. It started 813,000 years ago when a small band of survivors in Africa gazed upon a world that had tried to destroy them and resolved they were not finished. Every subsequent human accomplishment, every civilization, every innovation can be traced to that instant when humanity, at its lowest ebb, chose to struggle for existence. And that is one enduring legacy of the bottleneck. This is how an ancient catastrophe molded modern humans. So here we stand, 900,000 years removed from the most severe disaster humanity ever faced. 7 billion individuals populate every part of the globe, Earth's dominant species, absolute overlords of their environment. It's tempting to observe today's humans and believe we're unbeatable, that we've somehow risen above the natural rules binding all other life. Yet the genetic record reveals a completely different tale. Every living human being bears the molecular fingerprint of that prehistoric population crash, not merely as a historical aside, but as a core trait that defines human nature itself. That brush with extinction wasn't merely a close call. It influenced every aspect of who we are, our biology, our psychology, our abilities, and above all, our weaknesses. Let's begin with a fact that catches many off guard. Human beings share an astonishing degree of genetic closeness with one another, far more alike than one would expect for a species whose population reaches into the numbering in the billions and inhabiting every climatic region on Earth. Consider chimpanzees, the nearest living relatives to ourselves. An ordinary troop of 50 chimpanzees residing in one forest in Central Africa possesses greater genetic variation than the entire 7 billion humans put together. Take a moment to truly absorb that. 50 individuals spread over a few square miles contain more genetic differences than all humans from the Arctic to the Sahara, spanning Tokyo to Toronto, the Australian outback to the Amazon rainforest. Another example can be found in gorillas. Gorilla groups divided by merely a few hundred kilometers exhibit genetic distinctions that make the differences between a Norwegian and a Nigerian seem tiny. A person from China and a Cherokee, a native of Maui and a Moroccan. This remains the most evident inheritance of the population bottleneck. When a population is shrunk to just 280 individuals over 117,000 years, it does more than merely test their survival. It creates a genetic narrowing that forces out variation. All neutral mutations and arbitrary variations that do not directly aid survival are gradually eliminated. What comes through the other end is a genetically simplified population, bearing only the fundamental genetic tools required to endure the most severe crisis conceivable. Modern humans lack diversity because the opportunity for diversity never arose. The genetic bottleneck wiped out hundreds of millennia of gathered genetic differences. Afterward, when our forebears finally emerged from that crisis, their expansion was so rapid that substantial new diversity could not form, a fact visible in the genetic records of present-day populations. Within the whole human race, there's only about a 0.1% genetic difference from one person to another. Yet in most other species, that figure is roughly 10 times greater. Basically, every human is a cousin to everyone else. Maybe a far-off cousin, but still a cousin. Take a European and an Australian Aboriginal individual. They appear very distinct, and their ancestral lines likely diverged some 50,000 years back. Still, they share roughly 90.9% of their genetic code. That level of similarity is far from normal. It's the genetic fingerprint of a species that came close to extinction. But this closeness isn't just a fascinating fact. It has real-world implications. These effects can be measured in human health, and some of them are quite harmful. If a population shrinks to just a few thousand people, genetic conditions that used to be uncommon suddenly start showing up much more frequently. This isn't because the disaster created new mutations, but because basic math shifts the balance. In a big, varied population, damaging gene variants tend to get watered down. When you have a problematic gene, it rarely spreads far because it's only one variation out of millions. However, in a very small group, each genetic variation gains much more significance. Certain genetic disorders that afflict people today likely became common during that population bottleneck. Conditions like sickle cell disease, cystic fibrosis, and Tay-Sachs aren't fresh mutations. They're old variations that turned prevalent in small communities. These variants never got weeded out. Worse still, some endure because they offer what geneticists term heterozygote advantage. When you inherit a single copy of such a variant, you gain a certain benefit, but inheriting 2 copies leads to illness. The sickle cell trait is a classic example. Sickle cell trait perfectly illustrates this. 1 copy protects against malaria, while 2 copies cause sickle cell disease. Back in the time of the bottleneck, when any benefit was crucial, the population was small enough for such variations to spread rapidly. These kinds of genes became deeply lodged in our genetic blueprint. Nowadays, millions of individuals carry these genes, and the vast majority have no idea. However, for people who get 2 copies, the lasting impact of that ancient bottleneck is a lifelong struggle with health issues. Our immune systems were also shaped by the bottleneck, and we are just starting to grasp those effects. When genetic variety goes down, the diversity within our immune system goes down as well. Various forms of immune genes offer protection against distinct illnesses. Within a genetically varied group, nearly every disease-causing agent will come across certain people whose defenses can combat it well. However, in a population that shares similar genetics, one illness might impact each person in the same manner. This explains why contemporary human beings are susceptible to global outbreaks. Whenever a fresh virus appears, such as influenza or COVID-19, it can propagate throughout humanity with alarming speed. We lack the genetic variation that would guarantee a portion of us possess natural immunity. That diversity was removed by the population bottleneck. Certain scientists believe our susceptibility might be even greater than we currently understand. Evidence suggests that humanity experienced not only a single bottleneck around 900,000 years ago, but also multiple smaller contractions afterward. With each event, genetic variety declined further, making us increasingly homogeneous and more prone to disasters that affect the entire species. Yet it wasn't entirely detrimental. The bottleneck also bestowed upon us some extraordinary benefits. Recall that those 117,000 years represented the ultimate test of natural selection, and each survivor bore genes that had been proven under the harshest conceivable circumstances. Genetic traits for intellect, teamwork, flexibility, and endurance were not merely helpful, they were vital, and survival was simply impossible without them. Contemporary humans received this carefully honed genetic set. We are the offspring of those who endured, and that heritage manifests in surprising manners. In comparison to most other creatures, humans exhibit extraordinary resilience, thriving in habitats ranging from the frozen Arctic to the scorching Sahara. We are capable of adjusting to vastly contrasting eating patterns, and we can heal from wounds that would prove fatal to many mammals of similar stature. We can endure weeks with no sustenance, days with no hydration, yet still preserve enough mental clarity to tackle intricate challenges, and this is no coincidence. This is the inheritance from the bottleneck. Evolution so finely tuned our forebears' survival mechanisms that, by mammalian measures, present-day humans are nearly invincible. though not as individuals. Of course, we remain delicate in many respects, yet collectively as a species, we are exceptionally tough to eliminate. Observe the challenges humanity has overcome since that bottleneck. Glacial periods, dry spells, massive floods, volcanic blasts, space rock collisions, and diseases that wiped out a third of whole land masses. Time and again, humanity recovers, frequently emerging quicker and more resilient than previously. This isn't mere fortune. It's encoded in our genes. The population squeeze favored groups capable of rebounding after calamities. People whose mental strength remained unshaken under unimaginable strain. Communities that preserved teamwork even during times of limited resources. Breeding tactics that allowed swift population recovery following devastating declines. All of that is embedded within our genetic code. Each person living now comes from a continuous chain of ancestors who endured, reaching back over 900 millennia of trials that would have annihilated many other species. Yet possibly, the deepest impact of that population plunge is a philosophical one. It alters our perspective on both human diversity and our shared humanity. Today, we tend to emphasize our distinctions, such as various cultures, numerous ethnic backgrounds, many languages, countless belief frameworks. These variations are genuine and significant. They enrich human society, making it diverse and fascinating. However, genetic data reveals an equally vital truth. Beneath these external contrasts, we are fundamentally one people. This isn't figurative, it's factual. The genetic gap among any two humans is minuscule. We are practically identical when contrasted with the diversity found in most other animals. The earlier example of a Norwegian and a Nigerian, they share more genetic similarity than two chimpanzees living in the same woodland. A European and an Australian Aboriginal individual have a stronger genetic kinship than two gorillas inhabiting adjacent peaks. All people living today trace their roots to that same small group that endured a single disaster 900 millennia ago. Every one of us shares that identical chromosomal fusion, and we all possess the same genetic susceptibility to illnesses linked to population bottlenecks. We are all heirs to the very same survival traits that guided our ancestors across those harsh millennia. The visible variations among us, skin tones, facial structures, body shapes, are merely surface-level adjustments. These adjustments arose during the past 60,000 years as humans dispersed into diverse habitats. These are recent, superficial alterations layered upon a genetic core that remains fundamentally identical across our entire species. The idea of race as a meaningful genetic category is almost non-existent in human biology. The genetic diversity found inside any single racial group is almost as great as the diversity seen between different groups. It's impossible to accurately forecast a person's genetic makeup based on their outward appearance. Since the traits we observe are poorly linked to deeper genetic diversity, that ancestral bottleneck turned every one of us into relatives, close relatives, in fact. The degree of genetic likeness we display is exactly what one would anticipate. It comes from a species that grew out of a single, tiny population in the very recent evolutionary past. And that is precisely what we are. These findings carry consequences that stretch far beyond pure science, and they ought to reshape our understanding of human warfare, collaboration, and social structures. Every conflict, every mass atrocity, every instance of ethnic animosity targets individuals who, genetically speaking, are almost indistinguishable from those committing the acts. We are not battling a different species, and we are not even opposing distant cousins. We are fighting our own close relatives over distinctions that, from a genetic perspective, hold virtually no significance. This bottleneck ought to have imparted the lesson that we are all united in this journey, because we almost never existed in the first place. Yet this is not merely old history. The bottleneck also serves as a caution regarding contemporary frailties. That very scarcity of genetic variation which binds us as family also exposes all of us to identical dangers. Imagine a single supervirus that can infect just one person. It could spiral to infect every single human being, because our immune systems lack the variety needed to shield even a fraction of the population. A worldwide climate disaster wouldn't spare any community. simply because we've lost the genetic differences that once allowed certain groups to handle severe environments more successfully. We are engaged in a risky gamble, betting against both our natural surroundings and our own inventions. Nuclear arms, shifting climates, antibiotic-resistant microbes. From bacteria to artificial intelligence to lab-made plagues, any of these alone might set off another population crash. Now imagine 7 billion humans packed onto a single Earth. With all our systems so tightly linked, the collapse would be far more brutal. That ancient bottleneck, almost 1 million years ago, unfolded so slowly that a handful of our ancestors managed to pull through. If a disaster strikes today in just years or decades rather than over thousands of years, we might not get that same opportunity. The advantages our forebears enjoyed would no longer be ours. They endured because of genetic variety built up over eons, but we have already used up that treasure. We are operating with the bare minimum of genetic material, the basic set of tools that was sharpened during the last population crash. Should we face another bottleneck, we would have even fewer genetic options, and many researchers fear the early warnings are already flashing. For the past several hundred years, our global numbers have soared in exponential leaps, yet such growth must eventually hit a wall. Sooner or later, we encounter limits in resources and environmental pressure, and when we do, populations inevitably plummet. The only uncertainty isn't whether it will happen, but precisely when it will occur. From the bottleneck, we learn that humanity can weather astounding disasters, yet we also learn that every survival carries a heavy price. That stretch of 117,000 years erased most of the diversity that once enriched our ancestors, and a new bottleneck would take even more. If we keep repeating this cycle, we'll eventually create a species with such uniform genetics. One single illness, one shift in the environment, one unexpected obstacle could wipe us out entirely. We are not unbeatable. We are survivors, and that distinction matters. Yet the tale of the bottleneck also offers optimism. If our forefathers endured history's most severe ordeal using only rocks and hides, then surely we can overcome the trials we face today. We carry within us their genetic strength, along with 900,000 years of wisdom passed down through the ages. Today, we possess technology, advanced medicine, worldwide communication systems tools to foresee and ready ourselves for calamities in a way they could only dream of. But the real question remains, will we make wise use of these gifts? And the mystery still unfolds. With each passing year, fresh genetic findings shed more light on that ancient bottleneck and how it continues to shape who we are today. Cutting-edge sequencing methods now allow researchers to analyze ancient DNA from fossils that, just 10 years ago, seemed impossible to study. We are uncovering traces of migrations, intermixing between groups, and survival tactics that were completely unknown to us before. A number of recent findings are even altering our perception of the entire timeline. Initial guesses placed the bottleneck at around 100,000 years. But more recent studies of mutation rates and genetic variation hint that it could have stretched longer, perhaps 150,000 years, or even more. Each time we sharpen our models, the crisis appears a bit more dire, and the fact that they survived seems that much more miraculous. Other researchers are now discovering that the bottleneck may not have been as consistent across the board as we once believed. Various groups of early humans may have experienced their population declines at slightly different moments, or with varying severity. Intriguing genetic clues propose that a few communities might have held on to somewhat bigger populations. These groups acted as genetic sanctuaries, safeguarding variations that might have otherwise vanished. In addition, we are gaining deeper insight into the precise genetic alterations that took place throughout that bottleneck. It wasn't only the chromosomal fusion. Hundreds of other genetic variations also became widespread in that era. Among them are genes linked to brain growth, immune defenses, body temperature control, and how we handle stress. Each variant adds a chapter to the tale of how our forebears adapted to endure what seemed unendurable. And we are finding that certain of these genetic markers continue to influence us today in ways we never anticipated. These genetic variations shape our intellect. They impact personality characteristics such as adventurousness or collaboration, and govern our reactions to pressure and our ability to build social connections. That ancient population squeeze didn't only influence our physical form, it also molded the way our minds work and how we perceive the world. It carved out the deep patterns of our thoughts, our social connections, and our very experience of life. Each person walking the earth today still bears that inheritance. We are all born from that long-ago disaster, descendants of ancestors who kept fighting, even when total loss appeared unavoidable. We've inherited genetic improvements that were bought with the price of 117,000 souls, and this was the result of countless years of relentless hardship. Whenever you gaze upon another person, any person, you are seeing someone whose genetic makeup is nearly identical to your own, a person whose forebears endured the same calamity that your own forebears overcame. They carry those same genes for survival, the same fragile points, the same hidden possibilities. All the distinctions we squabble over, all the barriers we construct, those are merely evolutionary static. Just surface-level differences atop a genetic bedrock that is strikingly, almost impossibly, the same. That population crash rendered us all equal in the truest meaning of the word. Each of us is a survivor, bearing the same proven and honed genetic set. We belong to the same incredibly triumphant species that fought its way back from the brink and eventually took over the earth. But that knowledge also gives us a shared duty, for we now recognize what is possible. We have visited that precipice already, and we glimpsed just how near we were to total annihilation. And we understand that the same dangers that nearly wiped us out nearly 1,000,000 years ago, our shifting climate, dwindling resources, and environmental disaster, they remain, ever present, still menacing, still able to shrink us back down to just a few struggling souls fighting for our kind's survival. That population squeeze stands as a caution, a memory, and a teaching etched into our genes about how fragile life is and yet how tenacious. We made it through before, but what remains to be seen is whether we will extract enough wisdom from that survival. Never again put ourselves through such a harsh test, because next time, our luck might not hold. And so we find ourselves at the destination of an extraordinary expedition. 900,000 years ago, humankind came within a whisker of total annihilation. 99% of our ancestors were lost in a catastrophe so profound that the entire human race shrank to roughly 1,280 individuals capable of breeding. 1,280 individuals. That's less than the student body of most high schools, smaller than numerous apartment complexes, and that was humanity for 117,000 years. For a period longer than all of recorded history, our species hovered on the very brink of nothingness, and in every generation, the big question wasn't about flourishing. It was whether humans could survive yet another year. Yet those 1,280 individuals never surrendered. They evolved, they invented, they collaborated, and they did whatever was necessary to keep their offspring alive so they could eventually have their own children. Generation upon generation, for over 1,000 centuries, they persevered, and because they held on, you are here right now listening to this narrative. Ponder that for a second. Every human being alive today, all 8 billion of us, stems from that small group of bottleneck survivors. The person next to you on the bus, the barista who served your coffee earlier today, every global leader, every famous figure, every stranger you walk past on the sidewalk, we are all relatives separated by merely around 30,000 generations. We all bear the genetic imprint of that ancient catastrophe, the chromosomal fusion that marks us as the offspring of the survivors. Your DNA at this very moment contains sequences that were tested and refined during those desperate centuries. The genes that enable you to combat infections were chosen when diseases spread through tightly packed communities. The mental agility that allows you to master new abilities was refined when our ancestors had to constantly adapt to shifting circumstances. Even your ability to cooperate, to show empathy, to team up with strangers for mutual aims that was embedded in our genetic makeup during the bottleneck. When small groups had to operate seamlessly or face extinction, you are walking, living proof that resilience is effective. Collaboration outlasts competition in the end, and intellect and adaptability can conquer nearly any obstacle. Those early survivors, just a few hundred in number, possessed no advanced technology. No agriculture, no writing, none of the modern tools we now consider essential. But they did have each other, along with an unwavering will to carry on even when all seemed lost. And that perseverance persisted long after the crisis had passed. These resilient individuals eventually spread across 3 continents, giving rise to 3 unique branches of humanity. Their offspring came to dominate the chilly landscapes of Ice Age Europe, the lofty heights of Asia, and the ever-shifting terrains of Africa. They created language, art, technology, and civilization, enduring plagues, famines, ice ages, and droughts, while competing with enormous predators and continuously adapting. They adapted to every corner of the planet. In time, one lineage of that family, us, modern humans, accomplished feats their bottleneck ancestors could never have dreamed of, like walking on the moon. We have deciphered our own genetic code. We have constructed civilizations stretching across continents and communication systems that wrap around the Earth in an instant. We have transformed from a mere 280 individuals, fighting each week to scrape together enough food, to 8 billion people who can debate what to eat for dinner. Yet what truly fascinates me about this tale is that so much remains unknown. Even after decades of study, advanced genetic analysis, fossil findings, and climate modeling, enormous puzzles still await solving. We cannot say with certainty what triggered that genetic narrowing. Could it have been a massive volcanic eruption, a climatic upheaval, a widespread illness, or something we haven't even considered? There are hypotheses, but no definitive proof. We aren't sure precisely where the 1,280 survivors made their home. Somewhere in Africa, that much is certain, but specific locations remain a mystery. How were they spread out? Were they clustered in a single area, or scattered among various safe havens? How did they talk to each other during that critical period? Did they already possess a spoken language? Or did language develop right through the bottleneck, favored by evolution because groups with better communication were more likely to endure? It is unclear whether they kept memories of their ancestors from before the bottleneck. Did they pass down stories that recalled a time when humans were far more plentiful? Or did everything that happened before the crisis fade into oblivion? These enigmas stay trapped in ancient times, awaiting future findings to set them free. With each passing year, novel genetic methods uncover more of our deep past. Every decade brings fresh fossils unearthed by archaeologists, adding new fragments to the mosaic. This tale continues on. We are still uncovering our identities and origins, and that journey leads right to you. At this moment, as you listen, you are woven into this lasting narrative. The inherited essence from those 1,280 survivors circulates within you. The flexibility they cultivated empowers you to manage the intricacies of today's world. The teamwork abilities they perfected enable you to collaborate with individuals from vastly diverse origins and traditions. The endurance they represent provides you with the strength to conquer any obstacles that come your way. Should this narrative astound you, if discovering our species' overlooked catastrophe and remarkable rebound touched you in any way, please tap that like button. Share with me whether this exploration of our distant past struck a chord with you, and leave a comment indicating your listening location. Whether you're in New York, Mumbai, Laos, Tokyo, or São Paulo, your location is irrelevant. You share a link with every other viewer through an uninterrupted lineage of forebears reaching back almost 1,000,000 years to those 280 survivors. Truly, we are all kin, all offspring of the most exceptional survivors humanity has ever known. If you desire additional tales of this kind, further explorations into our overlooked past, the extraordinary occurrences that molded our present selves yet rarely appear in standard historical accounts, then press that subscribe button. We have only begun uncovering the concealed episodes of human development. Allow me to leave you with one last reflection. As you slowly fall asleep, you bear inside yourself the genetic material of those who endured. Individuals who confronted annihilation and steadfastly refused to surrender. Beings who withstood 117,000 years of adversity and emerged more resilient. Humans who adjusted to ordeals that would have obliterated any other creature. That constitutes your heritage and your birthright. Always remember it and rest peacefully.